My guest today is director Kareem Tabsch. Now, Kareem is a Emmy-nominated filmmaker, as his feature films include Mucho, Amor, and The Last Resort, and the short film Dolphin Lover. Now, Kareem's work has been included at film festivals like Sundance and South by Southwest, HotDocs, and has been featured in the outlets like the New York Times, the LA Times, and NPR, among others. But Kareem is here today to talk about his newest full feature documentary, Naked Ambition, the story of Bunny Yeager, who once heralded as the world's prettiest photographer, had a huge influence in 20th century pop culture, though few people know her name. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Kareem Tabsch and his film documentary, Naked Ambition, to the show. Welcome, Kareem.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I actually watched the documentary twice because I was so intrigued by this story. So, what intrigued you about Bunny Yeager's story?
Well, I am born and raised in Miami, Florida, which is where Bunny lived for 60 plus years and where she primarily worked. So she was kind of just a cultural figure that existed all around the place. But I think that, probably what really first intrigued me was these captivating photographs. They are, to see Bunny's work, it's, I think, impossible not to like them because there's such skill, such beauty. They really kind of just grab you. And, I'm a curious folks, like I think a lot of people are. And I want to know who made these remarkable images that have had such an oversized impression on our culture. And so that was kind of the curiosity that made me want to peek behind the curtain or behind the camera and learn about the brilliant Bunny Yeager.
So, do you know how many photos were left in Bunny's private archives, and what was it like going through all of them for the documentary?
I mean, there were. It's probably no exaggeration to say there were tens of thousands. She Bunny was very prolific of a photographer. Of course, only if she shot 100, maybe only five would have met her standard of like these are the ones that are going to get printed, or these are the ones that I love. And we could tell that because in going through her archive, you could see the contact sheets with the grease marks. The photographers use grease pencils and they mark, I like this image or I like that one. And so it was really interesting to be able to see that process. As a documentary filmmaker, primarily somebody who works a lot with archival imagery, oftentimes our challenge is that it's hard to find archival material. So many folks are too busy living their lives to kind of think about preserving all the things that they're doing. In my film Mucho More, even though Walter Mercado had been on television for 5 decades, his personal video archives were like, a beta tape over the laundry and some under the bed and really not put together. We had the opposite situation with Bunny. There was an abundance of archival material. I joke that Bunny was somewhat of a hoarder. I think she saved everything she ever photographed, everything she ever made, everything she was ever involved with. So being in her archives, which are remarkably quite funny, just a few blocks from my home, a little bit of a meant to be, was incredible because not only did she have, I feel like almost every photograph she ever took, but also things like the original bikini that Betty Page wore in those famous cheetah photographs. She had almost every camera that she'd ever used stored. She had a figure made specifically to her measurements that she used when she was making costumes for herself. Correspondence between her and folks like Larry King and Howard Hughes and all of these. It's just an abundance of material. So, as a doc filmmaker and somebody who is telling her story of her life without her involvement, because the film, tell that story in a moment, happened really after she passed. It was really, really helpful to have all of this because it helped us bring her work and her alive.
Well, did she start photographing herself before she started photographing other people?
No, I don't believe she did. It's a very good question that we that I think is one of the ones I would have loved to have asked Bunny. But Bunny started first, as a model. She actually started very young as a model. I think as young as 17 or 18 in beauty pageants. And back in the day in South Florida, there was a beauty pageant for everything. There was Miss Miami Beach. There was Miss Arbiter's Hot Dogs. There was just everyone, and so she won a lot of beauty pageants. And then she started modeling professionally into when she gained an interest in photography herself. But the earliest works were of other models she found, and sometimes not necessarily models. It was really what we would call today the girl next door. Um, I think that the majority of her self portraiture, while there was some early on, she really seemed to lean into it when she got just a little older. So she first started photographing other beautiful women.
Well, one of the things that I noticed in the documentary, and I want, and for all of you out there that are lovers of film documentaries, this is one you've got to see because it really brings clarity to what we're seeing today on social media. And what I noticed about Bunny was she really created the first selfie decades before social media came into view. But the thing that I really noticed about her selfies was that the poses that she created have really become the textbook for posing from all of the influences on social media today. And it shows how much she really was ahead of her time.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you mentioned that and you feel the same way. That for me, that was one of the really interesting things about making this film, which, in many ways we started before kind of selfies became the proliferations of selfies as just kind of abundant and as they are now. But, I think that part of that came because she first started off as a model before a photographer. So I think she learned how to pose herself and learning that confidence. And then when she got on the other side of the camera, she came to that with the experience of somebody who had been in front of the camera. And so she not only knew what she had to do, what made her happy, what other models had to do. And so she really kind of had this benefit of being on both sides of the camera, which is a rarity for photographers. And so when she really did lean into the self portraiture, she knew what she liked, particularly as someone who's taking her own pictures. She's like, I look great doing this. I don't look as good doing that. And they're kind of just, they stand the test of times. They're poses that were both very flattering to the figure and to the face, but also provocative and alluring, and ran the gamut. There's a section in the film which kind of runs through all the different types of expressions and energies you have to um, bring to photography. And I think you're absolutely right that it's kind of at the groundwork that she did decades and decades ago is something that we still see today. I mean, all you got to do is look up selfies on Instagram, and you'll see that it feels like they took a page out of the Bunny Yeager playbook. And you're absolutely right. I think she was incredibly ahead of her time. Bunny didn't, you know, officially invent the selfie, but I think she really did invent selfie culture, and it would be fascinating to see what she would think of it all today.
Yeah, because the thing about the poses, because when I was looking at her photographs in the documentary, it was the poses that we see today, and those poses were created because some models, to make them look, let's say, thinner in certain shots or maybe a little bit more glamorous. It's the poses. It's really it's a photography trick in a way. And I've noticed where so many influencers are using the exact same type of poses. Everybody's doing it. But when I watched the documentary, I'm thinking, wait a minute. Bunny was the one who was already doing this 40, 50 years before all of this other stuff came into view. And that's what impressed me and amazed me at the same time to see that somebody had already figured this out.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing is, those poses they differ per the model and per stage of life. So even with her self portraiture, and with some of the other models is. And that we see this today is that she learned, like, well, perhaps you have, you want to accentuate your bosom because it's not large, it's very large. Or maybe you have too large of a bosom and you want to, take it a little out of center stage. Or you want to look thinner. Or maybe you're too thin and you want to amplify. You want to show off curves. You want to minimize things. I think that the thing about part of her brilliance as it comes to posing, and I'm so glad you're talking about this with me today, because I feel I have not had an opportunity to talk about this. I think part of the brilliance is that it was not a one-size-fit-all approach. It was things that she brought and encouraged her models to do based on the body they had and what they wanted to show off, accentuate, because we all have, we're all self-conscious about one thing or another, whether we're a model or not. Before this interview started, I said, I got to make sure my hair looks okay. I mean, we all come to these with something different. And so that was part of her brilliance. She knew that if there was something that helped her model feel more confident and comfortable in her body, and addressed her hang-ups or her concerns, she was going to get a better photograph at the end of the day. And that's what she wanted. She wanted her model to be happy with the photos, and she wanted to be happy with the photos. So what are those tricks in posing that can get that best? And
So how did she get connected to Betty Page?
Betty was kind of a little famous already in the underground scene. She'd done some posing for the Claw siblings, which are brother sisters, who did kind of these very it was bondage pictures, mail order at that time. She had a bit of an underground reputation. She had participated in like camera clubs where they posed for a bunch of guys to take pictures of women in bathing suits. So she had a bit of a knowledge. I believe that if I'm not mistaken, and the making of the film is going back a few days. I believe that she heard that Betty was in town, and they got together that way. But also, Bunny would put sometimes ads in magazines, and there was a network of like, hey, of this person, and so Betty had kind of escaped down to South Florida, which is where everybody kind of escapes to from one thing or another, in 1954, and I think she photographed her over several sessions in 54 and 55. And those were the images that helped make Betty Page more of a mainstream famous, and eventually led to being in the pages of Playboy. So I believe that she found, it may have been an ad in the newspaper. It may have been she heard she was in town. I don't recall the specifics of it, but I do know that that collaboration made both of them famous.
Well, one of the things that in this documentary, you bring up something that I don't think today's generation understands or they even know. And it's the section of the documentary where she was doing all the early work for Playboy magazine. Her photos were not obscene. She knew the difference between nude and naked. Many today don't know the difference at all. She did, and you could tell it in her work. And that was the part of the documentary that intrigued me so much, because this is the thing about this documentary, you actually drew the line in the sand between before and then after. Because when Penthouse and especially Hustler magazine pushed the boundaries into porn, Bunny's career suffered, didn't it?
It sure did, and I think you're right about the nude versus naked. It was a distinction that Bunny herself would make. In fact, there's a clip of one of the clips we have of her speaking. It makes that distinction. Bunny was at the forefront of these men's magazine, and there was so many of them, and they were wrapped in paper and they were held behind the counter, and you had to ask for it, and discreet, and there was a sense of shame. When Playboy arrived in the scene, it was very different. It was an elevated magazine, a great magazine, not just of photographs of beautiful women, but a great magazine for literature, a great magazine for journalism. It really kind of came in and made a big splash, and Bunny was one of the earliest contributors to the magazine, really kind of helped shape its image. But as kind of the years went on, and in the post-sexual revolution, which she contributed to by really kind of bringing agency, helping bring agency to women about the power of posing for themselves. When the sexual revolution kind of came in and continued to go and go in another direction, uh, pornography, men's magazines kind of went to another extreme. The phrase that they would call it was going pink, and you could use your imagination what that means. Once magazines started doing that, it was obvious that there's not the same appetite for the kind of work that Bunny was doing. And she tried. She really did try to kind of adapt somewhat. I think there was lines that she really wasn't interested in crossing. But unfortunately, the magazines weren't necessarily interested in her style because it was seen at that point as a little passe. She was a little too. She was much more discreet than the things that were being appearing in the pages of Penthouse or in Hustler, which is it's kind of unfortunate and it's inevitable. One of the funny things is among the people we tried to interview for the film was Larry Flint, the publisher of Hustler, who was a big First Amendment defender and kind of one of the champions of the First Amendment in this country. Fortunately, scheduling never worked out, and he passed on before we were able to do that. But I was really interested in that perspective from somebody who produced, porn and was very successful at doing it. About the artistry around what Bunny was doing, I suspect he would have admired it greatly. It was just a little different than what his audience was looking for.
Well, what had happened was is that Pandora's box was opened, and once you do that, there is absolutely no way of going back because with her photos, even with the topless photos, they weren't obscene at all. Because if you really looked at them, there still was a sense of respected modesty. Then when the others came in, they completely removed that. And then it became explicit. And
Yeah,
she didn't there for a short time she was doing some of those photos, but she didn't like those poses at all.
yeah, she did try to. I'll say a couple of things about that. I think she did try to adapt, and there was a point where there was something that they called the pubic wars, which was when these magazines were deciding who was going to show pubic hair. Because to that point, it was mostly suggested that area of the body was covered, and you'd see women were topless. But I think Penthouse was one who did it first, and it was full on pubic shots. And then Playboy started doing it for a while, and Bunny adapted then. There's photos that she did in the mid to late 60s and 70s where pubic hair is much more front and center. And she did try to do things that are a little more risque and a little more in the face, but they backfired for her in a great deal. For one, I don't think her heart was in it. Although, to be fair, she did do some X-rated films. To in this day they would probably be R-rated films, but she did do some X-rated films at the time. But I don't think I think that was more of a avenue for commerce than it was necessarily for art. But the interesting thing of your earlier point is that when Bunny first started doing these photographs and photographing women in the nude, that was seen as obscene in the day. And so it's really interesting how part of what the film does and part of what her work does is chronicle the changes in society, really the changes in American society, which were so vastly great. It's funny that just let's say 20 years later, even just a decade later, from where she was photographing what would be considered obscene and what would be considered discreet, are so different. It just shows you how quickly society can move.
Yeah, but it's also too, and I have to keep going back because you, this isn't just a story about Bunny. This is a story how this section of, I don't want to call it literature or I guess really photography changed, but we're able to see the change happen in this film. And I mean, I would watch it and I'm like, oh my gosh. I'm like, we go from, because when I see Bunny's old photos, those would be the photos today that you could literally put in a gallery. Up until the point when Playboy and Penthouse Well, Playboy was like you said, it was like an elite magazine. It wasn't just women, it was like journalism and all that kind of stuff early on. But then when the other magazines came in, they didn't care about journalism. It was all about the photos. And
Yeah.
you saw that. But I also saw it in the documentary where Bunny, she tried to adapt because that was her income stream. So, like you said, she it was kind of forced upon her, even though she probably didn't agree with the style of photos that these magazines were wanting because she was the one early on that helped bring Playboy into mainstream.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We set out to make a movie about Bunny Yeager, this amazing artist that we love, who made such large contributions to our culture and society, and many people didn't realize it. But I think at the same time, ended up making a movie about the changing face and mores of this country. Because it's kind of much deeper than just Bunny and her work. She was a big contributor to those changes. And folks can argue till they're blue in the face about whether they went too far or didn't go far enough or what was right or not. But it's one of those kind of, I don't want to say it wasn't a happy circumstance because we knew it going into, but it was one of those opportunities where in telling a very specific story about Bunny's work, we were able to kind of take a step back and look at a broader landscape of the change in our country. And I think that was, really, really fascinating. I think Bunny as a photographer was more interested in the beauty of the nude figure. I don't know what her opinions about pornography would have been at the end of the day. I suspect that she would have been fully supportive that First Amendment supporter because she certainly faced the backlash of it at one point. So I suspect that she would have been like, "That's great. It should exist. I'm not necessarily totally interested in doing it." And as we talk about in the film, and I don't certainly want to give anything away, when she did kind of push the envelope the most she could, it had an enormous backlash on her career and on her personal life and on the life of her family. So it's a really interesting micro story about a very large change in our culture as Americans.
Well, she experienced cancel culture when there was no such thing at the time. Because I saw it in the documentary, I'm like, why did they point the finger at her when there were plenty of male photographers doing the exact same thing and nobody said a word?
And I think we have, Sarah Jane Blum, who's a historian and now owns the Bunny Yeager archives, makes the point, a beautiful, famous woman who was not ashamed became an easy target. And I think that that was a real part of it. So, I think she definitely dealt with a lot of misogyny in her career. And you're right. Why was she the one who's pointed out? Why was she the one who's hauled out to into the courthouse with these charges of obscenity? There's also some thoughts that some of it could have been retribution from her husband's work. Her husband was a police officer, a detective, and eventually was working in internal affairs. So there's some theories that might have had something to do with it. But there's no doubt that Bunny faced things as a female photographer that her male counterparts didn't. And that's striking. But I always like to think about the fact that she persevered. She was kind of, she was down and out. She didn't let herself stay that way, and she adapted. And she was incredibly ambitious. This is hence the title of our film. And initially we were going to call the movie "The Reluctant Feminist" because I don't think Bunny ever identified as a feminist, although she was very much about women making choices for themselves and about having agency and about having a career outside of the home. As we went on, we realized that one of the most remarkable things about her in that time was the incredible amount of ambition she had. She was not willing to let good enough be what it was. She had success as a model. And then she said, "I could take these pictures," and she did it beautifully. And then said, "I could write these books." And she published, I think, 20 books in her lifetime. She started working in films. She had a nightclub act. She produced events. She did so much. And I think that ambition is one of those things that every time she was told, "No, you can't because you're a woman. No, you can't because you're in Miami. That's not a big epicenter for this arts and culture." she just wouldn't take that as an acceptable answer, and she strove for more and did more. And it's one of the things that I walked away admiring her so much for.
Yeah, she never slowed down at all. Now, tell me
No.
how did were you the one that shot the footage with Larry King, or was
Yes.
that archived?
No, no. The only archival interview in the film is the Hugh Hefner interview. Um, of people who are not, but no, I actually did. I interviewed Larry, who was, as you can imagine, just a great storyteller. And a lot of people don't know is that Larry King started his career in Miami and Miami Beach. The first 20 years of his career in radio and television were in South Florida, and so and he knew Bunny somewhat then, and he was very much kind of the community of the era. And so it was important for us to be able to get him in the film because I think, one, yes, he knew Bunny, but also he kind of was able to help paint a picture of the Miami of that era in which Bunny was becoming incredibly famous in. And he's just a great storyteller.
You
I
know,
mean,
his stories were so good. I'm not going to give anything away because I want people to see this film because you really have to pay attention to Larry King's stories about Bunny because you're going to go, really? Those were so cool to see, but I thought the story of her daughters was very, very interesting because one wanted to preserve her mother's legacy, the other basically wanted it erased because she felt embarrassed about her mother's work. So, what was your opinion about her daughters?
I think that one, we were so fortunate to get both of her daughters in the film. In a way, if I'm not sure if they would have been as forthright if their mother was still alive. Because it maybe not want to kind of shake up any family turmoils or past trauma at that point. I'll say to their credit that they both were very candid. They answered honestly, and they did have very different opinions about their mother's work. So Sherry Lou, the older daughter, really kind of wanted nothing to do with the work. I think she loved her mom. That was very evident, and she made that point. But she never thought that the photographs were respectful of women. She had a problem with the nudity, and so she was uninterested in her mother's work. And I'm not sure if she'd use the word ashamed, but I don't think she would use the word proud either. I think she admired her mother's talent, and she recognized her mother's talent, but she wasn't comfortable with the work and wasn't interested in keeping that alive. And she said she wished her mom had a different legacy. Whereas Lisa, her younger daughter, worked with her mom. She worked with her mom for, I want to say, 20 years, and worked very closely with her and had a very different relationship with it, and was very, she loved her mother's work. She thought it was beautiful. She wanted it to kind of continue being out there and champion. And I think that those differences of opinion around the work certainly created some friction in that sisterly relationship. I hear they're in a good place now, and getting along. But I thought that it was important to have both of those point of views because these are the folks who knew Bunny the best, certainly knew her the closest. And I think also that they represented, in a way, they were kind of avatars for our audience, right? They brought two different point of views. There are people who love Bunny's work, who are very kind of pro nudity and pro the beauty of the body being photographed, and there are people who tend to be like, you know what? No, I think nudity is something for the privacy of the home, something that should be only shared with your significant other. And I thought that in having them show this kind of differing view, they were also in a way speaking for a large swath of our audience. But to their credit, they both have given us a lot. And Sherry Lou, despite her feelings about the photographs, has participated in Q&As. She's traveled to see the film, so she's been really, really, really great and very, very appreciative of us. And I think the best compliment we can get is she said, I think you guys were honest and told the complete story. And as a documentarian, that means the world to me.
One of the things that I kept watching in the documentary, and when people see this documentary, I want them to take a really close look because I don't I don't know if you know how well you did this work because in this film, when you show the photos that Bunny took, those photos reveal on film look so much better than all the digital photos that we see today. There is something about the way that Bunny would take photos and with a film camera because there was no such thing as digital back in the day, but there is this artistic look that real film gives, let's say, a human subject that digital will never have. And you
Yeah,
really show this because you also proved, and it's so funny because, when we think of photographers back in the day, we're always thinking about male photographers. Now there's probably as many female photographers as there are male. But Bunny knew how to use a film camera.
she sure did, and she used one to the day she died. She loved film. I think she experimented maybe a little bit with digital, but there's inarguably there's a different quality to film. And one of the things, there's so many things that we weren't able to do in the film, and talk about. And one of them was some of her photography techniques. She did something called fill in flash, which is, even though a lot of her photography occurred outside, you see a lot of that in the film, she still used flash in those photos because it helped bring in extra points of light in areas that there would have been otherwise maybe a small shadow, and it filled in the photograph. So that was kind of one of the things that she championed. She loved natural light wherever she could use it. And there is a quality that is captured in film that digital really can't replicate, whether that's photography or film itself. I mean, that being said, our these days it's almost impossible to make a documentary or film shooting on 35 millimeter film. So our film was shot all digitally, and maybe that's what, and beautifully, I should say, by the great cinematographer Ed Talavera and Joey Dowd. But when it comes to those photographs, there's absolutely, the film really shines. And I was so fortunate to make this film with a dear friend and co-director, Dennis Scholl. We've made two films together, and this is the second. And he always says, and I make films about people and different things, and he really focuses on art and artists. And one of the things that is very important to him is to make sure that the art is the star of the show. And I think that was so important here because it's so remarkable, and it does have this other quality, not just because of the brilliance of Bunny as a photographer, but because of the beauty that actual film brings.
Yeah, it's the beauty that real film brings, and you can see that in this documentary. And I noticed that the video footage of Bunny taking photographs of models, was it her husband taking the video?
Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was. So her, not always, but her, if they were going out in public, there's a few different models. Her husband would kind of come along sometimes to kind of act like a security bodyguard, making sure nobody was messing with them. And sometimes he would be taking some of that video in the background. Some of them was a video camcorder she would set up, and there were static shots. You could see that a couple of times in the film. But no, her husband was around quite a bit. I think that Bud was an interesting guy too. I think in many ways he lived within the shadow of his wife's fame. She became much more famous. I think, he had other talents for sure. I think his daughters would say that, but maybe nothing that rose to the occasion of what Bunny was able to do. And they collaborated a lot. Like I said, he assisted. He went. He shot some behind the scenes cameras, and they even made some films together that he helped produce, and in fact was in them. But the other great thing that we had archivally that kind of came up in this process is were all these home videos. And so there's this, you see it in the film, which is a lot of just like home videos, of Bunny and Bud and Cherry Lou and Lisa, of behind the scenes of her shooting, and sometimes even Bunny shooting her models when they were just kind of playing around before the photo sessions. So we treated those differently. Those have kind of warped a little bit with time. They have some of that, the grain has kind of come out. There's some scratches in it. We left those alone so that folks can kind of really see those in an unedited way. And then some of the photographs we certainly helped restore so that they're in their best shape. But Bud was present for a lot of the work because Bunny also photographed a lot in her own home. She had a beautiful home. She sometimes would borrow if somebody had a mansion in Miami Beach or a gorgeous home somewhere, and she'd borrow those. But there was a lot of photographs that were shot at her own home. In fact, I think that if I'm not mistaken, I think that the famous Betty Page photograph that eventually, wearing the kind of Santa hat with the ornament ever so placed. I think that photograph was in front of Bunny's Christmas tree. So Bud was around a lot, and the girls were around for quite a bit of it too. Not all of it, but they certainly met a lot of the models, and they knew them or they played with their children. They talk about that in the film somewhat too.
I was surprised because as pretty as Bunny was, that she didn't end up being a movie star. But I guess because she was really an entrepreneur, that when she found her niche with the camera, she ran with it.
Yeah, it's funny. I think Larry King says this in the film. She was gorgeous, and she could have been professional model for much later. She could have probably been a movie star. No doubt about it. And I think it was a couple of different things. I think one is she was an entrepreneur. I mean, before that word was even popular, that's who she was, and she contributed to the home. They lived a very nice upper middle class life that was, in large part because Bunny brought money into the house. They would have not been able to have lived on that on just kind of a policeman's salary. I think the other thing is that, I don't know that she was ever really willing to get up and leave South Florida, leave Miami. They had built a life here. Bunny was originally from Pittsburgh area, moved to Miami when she was about 16 or 17, and had been a wallflower. And when she landed in Miami, she said, "I get to be something different." And in fact, even her name, her real name is Linnea Yeager. Bunny came from watching a film, I think it was called Breakfast at the Waldorf, with Lana Turner. And Lana Turner played a character named Bunny. And she said, "Ha, I'm going to be Bunny." So she created this persona in Miami. And she had, I think, this real affinity for the city. And her parents were living here. And she got married here. And so I think uprooting and moving to LA or Hollywood at the time, which really was the only option if you were going to be a movie star at that era, you couldn't do it anywhere else, would have been disruptive for her. And she loved Miami. She loved South Florida. She thought that the light here was like unlike any other. And I do think that she was able to do more here in many ways than she could have somewhere else. Miami has grown as a city in enormous ways, but it was a very different town. It was relatively, with the exception of parts of Miami Beach, it was a relatively sleepy southern town. We don't think about Miami now as the South, but it was definitely a pretty conservative, outside of Miami Beach, pretty conservative area, pretty southern. And the fact that she was able to become kind of as famous as she did, as she became, and do as much as she did, is, I think, just a testament to her drive and to her ambition. But yeah, I think she could have ended up being a marquee name had she gotten up and moved to Hollywood at 21. But I'm really glad that she's decided to stay in South Florida, and that because otherwise I don't know that she would have created this incredible body of work.
Well, yeah, I mean, just in her looks alone, she rivaled Marilyn Monroe or Jane Mansfield.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of Jane Mansfield a lot, actually. I think, to me, she looks a lot more like Jane Mansfield than Marilyn, but she was, she was a blonde bombshell. I mean, you look at these photographs, and sometimes a brunette bombshell, but you look at these photographs and you say to yourself, this is the person who would have been on a movie poster in any of these movies that you would have seen in the 50s or in the early 60s, without a doubt, like, just on her sheer beauty. And she loved being in front of the camera. She did try her hand in movies, right? She was in films in much smaller roles, and she's in Sinatra's Tony Rome and a couple of other things that shot locally in South Florida. So I think she always had that. She always had that itch for being in front of the movie cameras, but I think there was probably a trade off that she just wasn't willing to make.
So, what's been the reaction to the film?
The reaction's been great. It's wonderful to see so many people discover her work and really kind of love what she did and learn more about her. Some folks knew the name, or some folks hear Betty Page, and that is kind of what drives them in. And they see some of the people, they see the names of some of the people in the film, like Larry King, like Dita Von Teese, like Bruce Weber, and that's drawn them in. And they leave with this newfound appreciation for Bunny's work and her contribution to culture and society that so many people don't even realize. I always am excited when people say, "Where can I find her work? Where can I learn about her?" Because that means that we did our job at the end of the day. I want folks to be able to leave this film one thinking about the change in our culture, like how far we've come as Americans as a society, thinking about the changing role of women and artists, but I also want them to leave thinking, I need to find out more about Bunny Yeager because she's brilliant and a bit of a badass. And so there's wonderful places to find out. Bunny's work is now entering the auction market, so you can actually buy original prints of Bunny's work if you start following some of the auctions. There's a couple of really beautiful books by Rizzoli. One's called Bunny Yeager's Darkroom that was published right before Bunny died. But that's a gorgeous bound edition of really a highlight of her entire career. So I'm most excited that people are interested in discovering her work. It's very gratifying being in front of an audience who walk in maybe a little trepidatious about the work and maybe leave with a new admiration for her. It's really, really fulfilling because this is a project that took a really long time to do. So it's great when people respond as well to it. It's very gratifying. It's something that both Dennis and I are incredibly proud of.
Well, I just love the way that you meshed not only her life and her work, but you brought in for the audience to actually see the changes of the 20th century, and to see not only pop culture, but to see changes in how the public views certain things. And it's like this underlying story. It's actually the story in this film that adds so much weight, because we're looking at her first, we're looking at her work, we're like, wow, this is really cool. She invented this, she did this, she wrote books about the poses and all of these things. But then there was society, and you meshed it together so brilliantly. And where can everyone see this film?
Well, I think our theatrical tour is coming to an end. We played in lots of major cities across America, but the film is coming out digitally on November 4th. So you'll be able to get it on iTunes or wherever you download films. It'll probably be on Amazon as well. We're hoping that it finds home with the streamer. There'll be a home video release for those who still kind of collect Blu-ray and DVDs like I do. They're making a big comeback. So that I'm not sure when that's coming out, but digital release is on November 4th, and I encourage folks to watch the film. And I'd love to hear what your thoughts. Reach out via social media, Instagram, and let us know, because I love nothing more than meeting a new Bunny Yeager fan who's discovered her work, and we so appreciate when people watch the film and let us know. That's what we do it for. We do it so that folks can watch it, and you don't have to love it, but if it makes you think, and it makes you form an opinion one way or another, then we did our job.
Yeah, you did your job. So, you working on anything new?
Yeah, a couple of different things. Well, I should say that my co-director Dennis Scholl is also a visual artist. He has a big art show that's opening up next week in South Florida, in Hollywood, and touring. He's making a film about the great Leroy Neiman. He's the most popular artist in 1970s America. Everybody thinks it's Warhol. It's actually Leroy Neiman. So he's making a film on that. I'm working on a couple of different things. I have a true crime series that I'm producing that we're out developing. And I'm working on a documentary about Anita Bryant. And some of folks might remember Anita Bryant as a very famous kind of voice and spokesperson for Florida Orange Juice, and really kind of about her role in the gay rights movement of the 1970s. And so that's another film about the past, but it's also really about the present. It just kind of like Naked Ambition, because obviously a lot of those issues are at the forefront again today. And then another South Florida story rooted in South Florida, but with larger implications. So I'm really excited about that one in particular, and probably a year or two out from when it will be done, but hopefully we'll chat about it then too.
Oh yeah, we will. We'll definitely be chatting about that. And wow, ladies and gentlemen, the incredible full feature documentary film Naked Ambition, the story of Bunny Yeager, who once heralded as the world's prettiest photographer, had a very huge influence in 20th century pop culture, though few people know her name. Now, whether by popularizing the bikini or helping discover Betty Page, shaping the image of Playboy, or inventing the selfie, well, Bunny was a trailblazer whose work bucked against the conservatives' 1950s America and helped pave the way, well, I should say, pave the way for the feminist movement and the sexual revolution. Yet the very changes she helped usher in would soon render her a forgotten relic until now. Featuring Dita Von Teese and Bruce Weber and Larry King's last film appearance, Naked Ambition is a rediscovery of a brilliant and talented forgotten artist. And Kareem, I want to thank you so much today for sharing this amazing documentary about Bunny Yeager with me.
Thank you so much for chatting with me and for championing the film. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and ladies and gentlemen, if you could still head to the theater to see Naked Ambition or wait until November 4th when it hits streaming, this is a documentary. Many of you know I am a big lover of documentaries. I love to hear the stories of people who are still with us and those that are not, but to learn the backstories on what, well, made them famous and, well, became a great influence upon our society. And Naked Ambition about Bunny Yeager is exactly that type of film. So be sure to catch it and watch it, and you'll be amazed, just like I was. So, ladies and gentlemen, you can catch all of the Bond on Cinema interviews at bondoncinema.com. Check out our Prime show, our YouTube channel, and yes, you can listen to us on your way to work or play on Spotify, iTunes, Audible, and more. And remember, you'll either see me at the movies or from the red carpet.